Out in the freezing cold, thousands of refugees and migrants are enduring a terrible winter right at the edge of the European Union. And indeed, many have tried to cross only to face violence from border guards, leading to a warning from the United Nations that the asylum system itself is under threat in Europe. This is Roundtable. Hello and welcome from me, David Foster. It is an issue we've covered before on recent programs, and we make no apologies about going back to it. But for many people, things are getting worse and worse. Awful winter weather and no proper places to stay. Migrants continue to make dangerous and potentially life-threatening journeys across Europe. In northern Bosnia, thousands of migrants and refugees from the Middle East, South Asia and Africa have been stranded in tough winter conditions, hoping to cross the border into Croatia and the European Union. Many say they've faced violence from Croatian security forces who've pushed them back across the border.
For 4 months, I keep getting arrested by the police and sent back. Look here, she's ill, he's ill, everyone's ill.
The United Nations Refugee Agency recently warned that the very idea of asylum itself is under attack in Europe. UNHCR called for an investigation into the violence against migrants at Europe's borders. The EU border force, Frontex, is already under investigation by the EU's anti-fraud watchdog, facing allegations that its guards have been involved in forcing refugees and migrants out of EU waters at the sea border between Greece and Turkey. So, is the principle of asylum under threat in Europe? And what needs to change? Okay, let's get the conversation going. I'm very pleased to say that joining us on this round table out of Berlin, we have Hanaa Hakiki, legal advisor at the European Centre for Constitutional and Human Rights. We go to London and see once again, welcoming back to the programme, Matt Saltmarsh, Senior Communications Officer for the UNHCR, and in Athens, Eleni Konstantopoulo, humanitarian aid worker and advocate for refugee rights. Matt, it's not that long ago that you were on the programme talking about pretty much the same subject. What has the UNHCR been able to do in the meantime?
Well, we've been advocating and making some noise really about the situation. I think since March 2020, so almost a year now, we have seen an increase in the number of reports of pushbacks, of denial of the right to asylum and process, and denial of entry in a number of countries. We think this is incompatible with international law, with European law, and with national law. And in many cases, these incidents have been violent, and there's a sense that it's becoming systematic. So, I mean, we're asking the EU to conduct independent monitoring and for the individual countries to halt these activities when they're taking place. Of course, the backdrop of this is that there is a legislative package coming through the EU, and we hope that this can help to maybe address some of these issues.
Are you talking about their new charter, which we talked about on this programme not so very long ago, in which it was suggested that things had to change because there was little accountability, little burden sharing across European countries?
That's right. I mean, we think burden sharing rather than burden shifting is absolutely paramount here. It's important that not just a few countries bear the burden of the arrivals, but there's also more to it than that. We think that asylum processes need to be improved. We think that disembarkation processes need to be shared around more equally. And we think that underlying that, this sense of burden sharing and also relocation, being able to move asylum seekers around the continent so that different countries in the region play their part, is all very important. In addition to that, there's an international dimension. There's addressing the root causes. There's supporting the countries in the developing world which host the greatest number of refugees, something like 85%.
Fine words, Matt, but we'll talk about what has actually changed, if anything, in just a moment. Let me go to you, Eleni, if I can, because I know you've been unable to get out as much as you normally would do because of COVID, etc., etc. But the conditions for these migrants and refugees, not just on the Bosnia-Croatia border, are appalling.
Yes, they are. They're very difficult. Also, access to asylum in Greece is very difficult right now since it's changed onto an online platform. A lot of refugees don't have access to technology, or they don't understand the process. There is no legal access to legal aid. They can't afford to hire their own lawyers. A lot of them are in camps for 2 to 3 years and still have not had their first interview. There's a huge backlog of asylum claims in Greece right now.
Well, it's not just in camps. Let me play you this little clip from one of our reporters on the ground talking to these unfortunate people. This is in northwestern Bosnia. Terrible times, harsh winter conditions, nowhere to go, and officials are refusing to take in new migrants. This is what he found out. Just a clip anyway.
This is what it looks like in one of the abandoned buildings. There's no running water, no showers, and people sleep on the concrete floor. They rely on food handouts from aid workers and local residents. An estimated 900 migrants in Unhcr canton have no access to housing or basic necessities. They have two options: sleep rough in freezing temperatures or squat in abandoned buildings like this.
The situation here is really bad. Everyone is suffering from severe itching. Food supplies are low. There's no doctor here or medical facilities.
Well, that's on the border between Bosnia and Croatia, northern Bosnia. We're also talking about these days Hungary, the Greece-Turkey border, the Italian border. Are the issues expanding across the European Union?
I think they are. I think with even though we've had a decrease in flow of migrants, the camps are overwhelmed. I mean, look at the conditions on Lesbos. We don't often talk about the conditions on the mainland camps, but even in mainland camps, a lot of the people are housed in rub hulls and in tents, especially the unregistered refugees. So reception conditions are very, very difficult for the refugees.
I'll talk to you, Matt, in just a moment about the UNHCR's responsibility, but I noticed in our producer's notes, Eleni, and then to you, Hanaa, that you felt that the United Nations have been too slow in this.
I think there's been a lot of questions, particularly on the Aegean Islands. We've had that situation going into 6 years right now, and we've not seen any improvement. There's the issue of winterization and the wash conditions under COVID. So, I mean, this is a long-standing issue in the reception conditions, and it's not been addressed.
Hanaa, what do you make of what the UNHCR is doing? As I said to Matt, fine words, but it requires some kind of action. They're calling for things to change. As we know, not many things have changed. What do you make of what the UN is doing?
So in terms of legal accountability, I mean, I think you've been saying that the issue of pushbacks, I heard, has been very visible perhaps for a year, but it's a very long-standing issue. We started working in 2013, and it was already long-standing then. For Spain, it was 2005. For Greece, we have the first report from Human Rights Watch in 2008. As far as legal accountability goes, we've had successful cases in front of the UN, and they've been doing their job. The ones who haven't been doing their job are EU institutions, the ones with the real power to change things. And in terms of how widespread this is, you mentioned a few countries. One should also mention Spain, but also Poland, Romania, but also Germany, who does automatic returns to Greece without any procedure to check the situation of people in Greece. And those are also pushbacks, even though there is some sort of fast-track procedure. These pushbacks should not be forgotten because they are part of the whole failed system of EU asylum and access to asylum.
Well, when you say other groups have responsibility and should be the ones bearing the responsibility for this, which ones are you talking about?
EU institutions. So in particular, I mean, pushbacks are only the other side of the medal of EU migration policies that we've seen implemented since 2016, which are to basically not accept responsibility for people in need of protection who are and who reach EU territory. And the official side of that is the EU-Turkey statement, but the unofficial side of it are the pushbacks. And I think the reason why we hear about them now is because after 5 years of this policy and the complete lack of accountability, they've become not only widespread, but also more and more brutal and cannot be ignored anymore in the whole EU asylum reality.
But why is nothing being done? Why are these people still in freezing conditions, facing violence, intimidation, the inability to get there? Why are they being pushed back over borders? Why has nothing been done when it's been going on for so long and indeed is getting worse?
There's a complete lack of political will to do something about it, because addressing pushbacks would mean giving access to every single person who enters EU territory to means to a protection assessment and to means to have that protection covered. So interpreters, legal advisors, and that goes completely against the EU's focus on stopping what they call irregular entries. But yet we know
okay,
that
well, sorry to jump in, I didn't mean to cut you off. I will come back and ask you in a little while how many of these you think, and it's difficult to tell without examining each individual case, how many of them are asylum seekers as opposed to maybe economic migrants. But Matt, I want to come back to you, a little bit of criticism then for what UNHCR has done. First of all, tell us what you think has been achieved, and then we'll go through some figures.
Well, on the question of Greece specifically, the situation is managed by the Greek government, which is supported by the EU. We are, of course, there on the ground as a humanitarian agency alongside a number of other agencies and NGOs. And of course, we do what we can, particularly in light of COVID. We've been trying to bring in more supplies and more support, but the situation is incredibly difficult in light of COVID. And of course, we had the fire in Moria towards the end of last year, which brought things to a head. Since then, work has been done to try to address the situation better. There have been some relocations, both to the mainland in Greece and also to other European countries of children and families. So there has been some progress, but of course, an awful lot more needs to be done. I mean, that's in terms of what's happening on the ground. And then
are you getting cooperation from the European authorities? Because Hanaa seemed to suggest that they were wiping their hands of any kind of responsibility.
Well, on the ground, in terms of access, yes, I don't think that's an issue. What we would ask for more of from the European Union is solidarity. So many more refugees and asylum seekers need to move to safety, to better reception conditions, to other parts of Europe, away from those frontline states. And we simply haven't seen that. We had an attempt at relocation from the EU in 2016, and it fell well short of its targets. And I mentioned the proposals on a new pact on migration. We hope that these will contain some new relocation mechanisms, but on the political side, we haven't seen a huge amount of willingness from countries, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, to step up and to support those frontline countries.
Right, we're going to go through some of the figures, and I've got a question for you at the end of that, Matt. According to your organization, the number of migrants, refugees trying to get into the EU is actually falling by sea, by land. 2019, I think it was, the number was 123,700, down to 95,000 in 2020, a decrease of, I think, 23%. What are the figures now, and what are the reasons for the numbers going down, Matt?
Well, it seems that the numbers are continuing to fall. For January of this year, the number of land and sea arrivals was around about 4,500. So that's continuing that trend of declining arrivals. And likewise, the number of new asylum claims in Europe has also been falling. That was down last year by something like 37%. Still a huge number, still above 400,000, but a significant decline. And that, we think, means that the situation is manageable, certainly when you compare it to 2015 and 2016. If you remember back then, in 2015, you had over 1 million new arrivals to the shores of Europe and by land. Why have the figures gone down? We think probably primarily due to COVID. It's made traveling much harder, but also we have, we think these new border restrictions, border measures. If we look back to the first lockdown just about a year ago, we calculated that something like 168 countries had partial or complete border closures. That meant that it was much, much harder for asylum seekers to get entry and then obviously to make claims in those countries. Some of those border measures have been removed, but not all of them. And as we mentioned earlier in the program, there have been these allegations and widespread reports of pushbacks as well.
Yeah, you mentioned COVID. Eleni, I want to come to you. You mentioned COVID, Matt. And I've been reading something from the Institute of Migration that suggests, I'm talking principally about northern Bosnia here, that there are increased tensions between the locals, those asked to host the migrants and refugees, and the refugees and migrants themselves, partly because of the fear of COVID. This is not an easy time, Eleni, to be in that position.
This is absolutely correct. We've had a couple of incidents, for example, in the Rizona camp back in last quarter of 2020, the local municipal hospital just started to not accept refugees, not only not for COVID, but for other cases. More recently in the same camp where the municipality is excluding the refugees from that community, there's about 2,500 people in that camp. They were excluded from school from the mayor and the municipality on reasons for fear of COVID and not allowing the children to attend public school.
Hanaa, let me come to you on this one. If the European authorities are, to some extent, and some of them, not all of them, washing their hands of this situation, basically allowing pushbacks to continue, and the intimidation at and the intimidation and violence that goes with it in some cases, would you dare to suggest that this is state-sponsored intimidation?
I think from the evidence that we have every reason to think it is. I mean, there is no way in Croatia, if you take the Croatian-Bosnian border, if this was not state-backed, there is no way this could carry on. It's too big. It's over 30,000 people for 2019. It's all the time. People have lived dozens of pushbacks, every single one of them. It cannot be, I mean, only by the omission, by not stopping it, you are already part of it.
Yes, the sin of omission to some extent, but do you think they're being encouraged?
I think they seem to be. I mean, for sure, what we do know is, for example, that Frontex knows as much as we know about pushbacks, yet they continue to notify groups of migrants to the Croatian border officers, knowing very well that what will happen is that they will be pushed back unlawfully with no process and probably beaten up.
What's going on legally with all of this, Hanaa, if I may ask you, because you talked about a number of cases in the courts. What are you trying to prove, and how difficult or how are you getting on?
Legal accountability is a long process in itself. When you're trying to get accountability from law enforcers, it also becomes more complicated, as Black Lives Matter has shown us. When you're trying to get accountability for law enforcers beating you up and dragging you to the other side of the border in the middle of the night in a forest, away from any witnesses or mobile phones or video recordings, you have a lot up against you. However, despite that, a few cases have already reached, for example, the UN committees. So the UN Committee for the Right of the Child has already found pushbacks to be against the Convention for the Rights of the Child. Also, a few cases have already reached the Strasbourg Court, the European Court of Human Rights. And even though the court has been sending mixed messages, some jurisprudence is developing on that front. And also,
let me ask you this. Do those legal judgments, do those cases in court make any difference to the men, women and children who are stuck in limbo?
I think every single reportage, every single report and every single court case makes a bit of difference. And together we can reach change, for sure.
Okay,
it's not quick
let me
enough.
come to you. Yeah, carry on. Sorry.
It's not quick enough, but we cannot just sit and watch. We have to do something.
And Eleni, while those people sit, as I say, in limbo, in freezing cold, in old factories, as we've seen, what happens to them, even though there's a legal case going on? Do their lives change at all?
Not while they're in camps and waiting. And even if they're registered and not in a camp and they've been fortunate to go into accommodations or hotel type for shelter, more vulnerable groups, they're still in limbo. They're still waiting. And that period where they're protected in accommodations is a very short period. It's 2-3 months. And then they're put out on the street, as we saw many scenes of Greece, of refugees having left the camps. They're registered and they have nowhere to go. There is no integration downstream plan in Greece. So they're still in limbo. And they can't even move forward if they want to, with all the borders closed.
Isn't it time really that we, instead of talking about pushbacks, we actually sort of simply say these people are being forcibly returned? I think we're being a little bit too pat about this, Matt, aren't we, really?
Well, there's obviously a difference between asylum seekers and those in genuine need of international protection and the broader term of migrants. And this is one of the most complicating factors of the whole issue. Depending on which route you're coming through, you have a different proportion of asylum seekers and migrants. And of course, asylum seekers have that right to have their case heard, to have due process. And then they may have the right to potentially relocate to a different country. In the case of migrants, it's much more difficult, it's more complex. We have a less handle on the numbers. And in theory, all things being equal, an economic migrant should be returned to the country from which they came, as long as their situation or their life is not in danger, and as long as that can be done in dignity. But we know that the reality of that situation is much more difficult on the ground. And I think therein lies a large part of the problem.
So let me ask you this. When you say in your report that the asylum system is under threat, are you referring to both the migrants and those genuine asylum seekers, or what in particular?
Well, we think the asylum system itself in Europe, in individual countries and collectively, can be improved significantly. That involves the speed of processing asylum claims. That involves mechanisms within Europe for allowing and improving the transfer of asylum seekers, improving safe.
Matt, let me stop you, sorry, because time is tight. The question really was, what is under threat here, as opposed to what could be done to make the situation better? You say the asylum system is under threat in what way?
Well, we think the way we put it is that asylum space. So, you know, the space that is given to asylum seekers in Europe and other parts of the world, we think is under threat. And we think these pushbacks, these reported pushbacks, these incidents that we've been discussing are really dangerous and bringing the system into danger there.
Okay, so the situation is bad, but the asylum system under threat. You're just saying because people aren't taking account of the rule of law, etc., things are only going to get worse, or will asylum be something that's consigned to the past because of what's happening?
Well, things have got worse in the last year, and that's what we've been talking about. So we are concerned that if there isn't a concerted effort at the European level to address these issues, then we will continue to drift, and we will continue to have a situation that deteriorates.
Okay, Eleni, let me come to you. Sorry, Hanaa, let me come to you on this one. I know you said that without changes, things will get worse. What sort of changes need to be brought in pretty much immediately?
So you spoke about how long it took legal cases, and I think you're right. And if we want to see change immediately, I think EU institutions who have the power to do that, such as the EU Commission, for example, should move. I mean, it's not only asylum, it's not only the Refugee Convention that is being violated, it's also EU law. And if EU institutions take the rule of law a little bit seriously, they should do something about pushbacks at all EU borders.
Are they likely to do that when they can't even get vaccinations out to as many people as they would like for COVID?
I think in many ways vaccination may be more complicated. I mean, when the EU Commission wants something about migration, they managed to do it. They managed to open hotspots in Greece and completely sort of put aside the normal Greek asylum system, I don't see why they couldn't get pushbacks in hand.
So if they want to do it, they could?
Yes, of course.
Do you think that will happen?
I think it depends on the political price they have to pay. And I mean, for now, given that pushbacks cannot stay unnoticed, I'm a bit more hopeful than, say, 2 years ago.
Thank you all very, very much indeed. The political price they have to pay, and we all know that in some countries within the European Union, migration is a very hot topic indeed. I understand what you're saying. Listen, thank you very much indeed, Hanaa. Thank you, Eleni. Great to see you again.
Thank you.
Matt, keep up the good work, each and every one of you, and we appreciate the time you've taken to be with us on this edition of Roundtable. Let us hope we don't have to go back to this subject that often in the future. Anyway, I hope to have you back sometime. Thank you, wherever you happen to be watching this edition of Roundtable. From me, David Foster, from the team that always makes it possible. We'll see you next time, we hope. Until then, goodbye.